At times during the hour-long episode, the conversation grew contentious, especially when Dr. Phil asked Buting if he felt Avery received a fair trial.
He never had a right to have a fair trial after Ken Kratz goes on live television and pollutes the entire jury pool from the state of Wisconsin.
Tell Dr. Phil why you wanted to keep the case in Manitowoc. You had the choice to move it. Go ahead, tell him why you wanted to keep it there.
Because the entire state was polluted. You
didn't want an impartial jury. You wanted a biased one that knew about his exoneration.
Do you think he ran red lights to get this conviction?
Absolutely.
And before the show even aired today, Jerry Buting tweeted, "Today on Dr. Phil, I try to set the record straight for Fossbender and Kratz, 2 versus 1. And Ken Kratz was also very active on social media today, sharing clips before the episode even aired. Reporting live in the Fox Valley newsroom, Emily Matesic, Action 2 News.
Emily Matesic has been following this case for years, well before it made headlines as a Netflix documentary. She's live in Manitowoc after looking through this huge court briefing today. Emily.
And Bill, as you said, this was a massive document. The clerk of court's office was a bit caught off guard by the filing today, as it was inequipped to actually make copies of this more than 1,300 pages for us. So instead, we had to sift through the document in the clerk of court's office. Now, some of the factors, the 6 factors that Kathleen Zellner is basing her argument for Stephen Avery to receive a new trial are ineffective counsel and new evidence were the largest sections of this filing. Now, Zellner claims Dean Strang and Jerome Buting failed their client by not putting expert witnesses on the stand to talk about DNA and blood spatter evidence during Avery's defense, among other things. Now, as for the new evidence, the motion points to the defense theory that Avery's DNA was planted. The motion suggests tests Zellner conducted concluded Avery's DNA on the hood latch of Halbach's vehicle was not the result of him touching it, and the DNA found on Halbach's key located in Avery's bedroom could have been planted using something like Avery's toothbrush. Now, included in the new evidence was testing called brain fingerprinting, a technique to determine whether specific information is stored in a subject's brain. A federal report suggests the testing has not been proven effective or useful, but according to the motion, through brain fingerprinting, Zellner's expert determined Avery's brain didn't show that he knew specific details about the crime. Now, the motion also tries to pin Halbach's murder on an ex-boyfriend, claiming he had motive, opportunity, and that he misled investigators about damage on Halbach's vehicle. Now, what was filed today is only Avery's side of the case. The Attorney General's office here in Wisconsin, which is representing the state, will now have an opportunity to file its motion with regard to this brief before any sort of decision or argument is made. For now, we're live in Manitowoc. Emily Matesic, Action 2 News.
Well, we did hear from Ken Kratz, who said he hadn't read the motion and didn't want to comment on its merits, but said, quoting now, Ms. Zellner promised test results would prove her client was wrongfully convicted. I suspect with science apparently now confirming Mr. Avery's guilt, she has chosen to make whatever incendiary allegations she can to make headlines with little regard for the Halbach family or the truth, end quote. Now, as this case drags on, the Manitowoc County executive says we can't forget about Teresa Halbach and her family.
I'm just concerned and have a very high degree of sympathy for the Halbach family because it comes up again and it will be on the TV and in the paper for a long time again, and their loss is every day, and it's too bad.
Just the past hour, Stephen Avery's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, arriving at the prison to tell her client the news about his nephew, Avery-Dassey. Nolan Barrett joining us live outside Waupun Correctional right now with that exclusive interview. Nolan.
Kevin, we spoke to Kathleen Zellner about a half an hour ago. She was coming out of the Waupun prison here after visiting with Stephen Avery. We spoke to her about the decision made by the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and she also gave Avery's reaction.
Oh, he's very pleased. We're extremely pleased, of course.
How did you take the decision?
It turned out exactly the way I thought it would.
Why is that?
Because it's obvious the confession was involuntary, and because of the cases that were cited and the analysis that was done of the facts. I don't think the Supreme Court will even take the case. but it's clearly the correct decision.
Says this makes Avery more optimistic about his future. We'll have that coming up tonight on Action 2 News. Reporting live in Waupun, Nolan Blair, Action 2 News.
All right, thanks, Dylan. And while Zellner says this makes Avery more optimistic about his future, some legal experts are saying not so fast.
Totally separate case, right? The supporters of Stephen Avery want to lump them in together and say, aha, see what happened with Dassey? This will be good news for Avery. It has nothing to do with Avery. Avery, I believe, and I've said this publicly before, I believe the evidence against Avery is incredibly overwhelming. And so it's a totally separate situation between Avery and Dassey. Dassey ought to be released. Avery, completely different story.
Kathleen Zellner was at this prison in Waupun earlier this morning. She visited with her client, Stephen Avery, and that's when we spoke to her afterwards. She said the ruling on Dassey's case was spot on because she believes it's obvious Dassey's confession was involuntary. She also says Avery was very pleased to hear the news, and it made him more optimistic about his future.
Ultimately, the system works, and you get the right evidence, and someone has the conviction vacated. But having Brendan Dassey's case, having it reversed, and the confession, which is a ludicrous story, finally having a court say the confession is just riddled with inconsistencies.
Zellner filed a 1,300-page motion asking for a new trial for Avery 2 weeks ago. A Sheboygan County judge will weigh the case. Reporting live in Waupun, Nolan Blair, Action 2 News.
It is the breaking news we brought you first at 4. A Sheboygan County Circuit Court judge denies Stephen Avery's latest attempt at a new trial. Brittany Schmidt joins us live from the newsroom as she pours over the judge's decision this afternoon. Brittany.
Cammie, earlier this year, Avery's attorney Kathleen Zellner sent a letter to the Sheboygan County judge asking for Avery's appeal to be placed in a lower court, hoping to allow Avery's recent 204-page motion where he claims ineffective counsel, saying he was framed for the 2005 murder of Teresa Halbach in Manitowoc County, to be used in its entirety. Stephen Avery and his nephew Brendan Dassey were each convicted of first-degree intentional homicide during separate jury trials in 2007. Prosecutors say they raped and murdered freelance photographer Halbach on the Avery property in 2005. But in a 6-page decision released today, the Sheboygan County judge denies Avery the chance at a new trial, saying the 3 arguments made about DNA testing fail to, quote, establish any grounds that would trigger the right to a new trial in the interest of justice. Avery's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, released a statement saying, quote, we are filing an amended petition because we have additional test results and witness affidavits. The scientific testing is not completed. We remain optimistic that Mr. Avery's conviction will be vacated, end quote. Meanwhile, Wisconsin Attorney General Brad Schimmel released a statement saying, in part, quote, I am pleased with the judge's decision, which brings us one step closer to providing justice to Teresa Halbach's family.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Bill is off today. We continue our breaking news coverage tonight of Brendan Dassey's overturned murder conviction.
In a 2-1 decision, a federal appeals court panel in Chicago upholds a judge's ruling to toss out Dassey's first-degree intentional homicide conviction.
Brittany Schmidt joins us live in the newsroom to explain why the Court of Appeals made that decision and now what is next for Dassey. Brittany.
Cammie, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals decision today comes from oral arguments heard back in February in Chicago. Both sides focused on the validity of Dassey's confession. Prosecutors argued Dassey's confession was voluntarily given, while the defense claimed it was coerced. In a 128-page document, the 3-judge panel explains why it upheld the lower court's decision from August that Dassey's confession was coerced. In the documents, the court says prosecutors didn't take, quote, special caution when talking to Dassey, saying prosecutors never assessed how their techniques truly affected the, quote, voluntariness of an intellectually challenged juvenile's confession. It goes on to say the state appellate court missed signs that Dassey was, quote, trying to please the interrogators and avoid conflict. This decision could set in motion the release of Dassey from prison after 10 years behind bars.
Kathleen Zellner walked out of these doors earlier this morning after talking to Stephen Avery. Speaking exclusively to Action 2 News, she says she informed Avery of the ruling made by the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals that says Dassey should be released. Zellner says she wasn't surprised by the ruling, as she says, and she believes that because she believes the confession was involuntary. Zellner says the ruling offers hope in the case against Avery.
He's extremely optimistic because when someone's innocent, and I've done this many times, they always are optimistic. I think he feels we have the evidence now to vacate the conviction, which we will do.
She is live outside the federal courthouse in Chicago with what we can expect today.
Catherine, we were here in February when both sides argued in front of that 3-judge panel, which eventually denied the state's request to reverse Brendan Dassey's overturned conviction. The state then asked for a hearing in front of the entire 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and that is what is happening today. Now, much like back in February, both sides will be given a set amount of time, 30 minutes, to argue their case. At issue is Brendan Dassey's confession and the techniques used by authorities when he was interrogated. 2 out of the 3 judges who heard Dassey's case back in February believe the confession was improperly gained by law enforcement officials, saying Dassey took promises made to him by investigators literally, and his story was inconsistent until detectives led him during questioning, meaning he was coerced. Attorneys today will be grilled on law and asked to cite specific cases to support their side. Now, as we said, each side will be given 30 minutes, but we're told it won't be much of an argument, instead more of a question and answer session with the panel. There is no timeline, however, on when a decision will be made. For now, we're live in Chicago. Emily Matesic, Action 2 News.
New at 5, Emily Matesic was in court today as the arguments were heard.
Teresa Halbach's family, as well as Brendan Dassey's mom, sat in the courtroom full of people as 7 of the 8 judges from the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals listened to arguments on whether to reverse Brendan Dassey's overturned conviction. A 3-judge panel from the same court earlier this year refused to grant the state's request. At issue is Brendan Dassey's confession. The state arguing investigators were well within their rights when they interrogated the teen, leading to his confession.
As we argued in our brief, courts have consistently held that there has to be a very specific offer for there to be a false promise of leniency.
But it's those promises the defense has issue with, claiming Dassey, with limited intellect, took them literally, especially when investigators quoted the Bible and said, "The truth will set you free."
But the record in this case is indisputably clear that idioms are the one thing that Brendan Dassey cannot understand. He has no choice because of his disabilities.
During the hour-long hearing, the judges peppered both sides with questions.
The investigators made my skin crawl watching this video, this lulling behavior that they conveyed, which was so dishonest.
Debating the issue back and forth.
A federal court cannot create new law on habeas review, and that's what you're asking for in this case. It's just flatly impermissible under all the Supreme Court's precedents.
Now that the case is in the hands of the court, there's no timetable on when a decision will be made. Both sides say, depending on which way the court rules, it's still too early to tell whether or not they will appeal this to the Supreme Court, which is the next step they could potentially take. Reporting in Chicago, Emily Matesic, Action 2 News. Brendan Dassey will remain in prison. That 4-3 decision was handed down today by the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals after it heard Dassey's case back in September. At the time of the hearing in front of the full court, the biggest issue was Dassey's confession. His legal team arguing Dassey was coerced into confessing to the crime. You may recall a district magistrate and a 3-judge panel agreed with the defense and overturned Dassey's conviction based on what they believed was an improperly gained confession. But in its decision, the 4 judges from the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals who sided with the state said investigator Mark Wiegert from the Calumet County Sheriff's Office and now retired Special Agent Tom Fossbender with the State Attorney General's Office used common interview techniques to obtain Dassey's confession. The decision went on to say that Dassey went with officers voluntarily and with his mother's knowledge and consent. Dassey showed no signs of physical distress, and Dassey was not subject to physical coercion or any sort of threat at all. The court said most of the incriminating details in Dassey's confession were not suggested by questions. He volunteered them in response to open-ended questions. The dissenting opinion again claimed Dassey was subjected to psychological coercive techniques and that his conviction is a profound miscarriage of justice. Now that the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld Dassey's conviction, his legal team tells us it plans to petition the United States Supreme Court, because while the Court of Appeals says that Dassey's confession wasn't coerced and that the techniques used were legal, Dassey's team says that these techniques were coercive, especially when dealing with a teen or someone who is mentally impaired. We'll continue, obviously, to follow this story. For now, we're live in the Fox Valley newsroom. Emily Matesic, Action 2 News.